If you lose weight fasting, don't you just gain it back with refeeding?
Yeah, when you go on a water fast, you lose water, muscle, and fat. And when you come off a water fast, assuming you're eating a whole plant food SOS-free diet, you regain muscle and water, and you continue to lose fat. Recently, we've done some work using a DEXA scanner to actually quantify the amount of fat that's lost. And not only is the dominant amount of fat lost, but visceral fat in particular is preferentially and selectively mobilized in water-only fasting. And so although a person may lose X percentage of their total weight, they'll lose a disproportionate amount of their subcutaneous fat and an even higher percentage of their visceral fat.
How does the weight loss on a keto diet compare to weight loss during fasting?
Well, what's most interesting is the loss of visceral fat, because visceral fat is the fat that's most associated with disease. And the ratio of visceral fat to subcutaneous fat in fasting can be upwards of 3 to 1. And in keto diets, the published data is much less than that. So it appears that fasting preferentially and selectively is mobilizing visceral fat more efficiently actually than anything else I've seen.
If the goal is detoxification of the body, what type of diet would facilitate detoxification?
I think that a whole plant food diet that's free of salt, oil, and sugar is going to put the body in the best position to mobilize and eliminate those accumulated intermediary products and exogenous products that are thought of as toxins.
What is the pleasure trap, and how does it make people fat and sick?
Pleasure trap's the hidden force that undermines health and happiness. Essentially, it's the artificial stimulation of dopamine in the brain. Dopamine is that neurochemical associated with pleasure. And with highly processed foods, more dopamine production takes place, so it's perceived as more tasty. That's essentially what good taste is the increased dopamine production that comes from that artificial stimulation of the salt, oil, and the sugar. So the dietary pleasure trap is really fooling the brain into leading to overeating, which results in obesity and the diseases of dietary excess.
What is your personal dietary program, and how long have you followed it?
Well, I'm fortunate because I live at the True North Health Center, where we have an opportunity to eat whole plant food SOS-free diet every day. And so we have oatmeal and fruit and greens or squash, things of that nature in the mornings. We have huge salads at lunch and dinner with steamed vegetables and some type of complex carbohydrate. It could be potatoes, rice, beans, or a dish from the Health Promoting Cookbook or the Bravo cookbooks or any of the other whole plant food diets that recipes that we have that are readily available for people.
How long have you followed patients on your recommended diet, and what have been their experiences?
So we're getting 30 and even 35-year follow-ups now on patients that we've been tracking essentially their entire adult lives. And it's really gratifying. The most common comment that we get from some of these people is that everybody they know is dead. My mother, when she turned 92, said she had outlived all 52 of her lifelong friends. And she said, "Alan, you need to warn your patients if they're going to do this diet. Make younger friends."
Should people expect to get accurate information on health and nutrition from their doctor, nutritionist, registered dietitian, university professor, and pharmacist?
Well, I think that it depends on who the doctor or the pharmacist is. Doctors that have made a point of becoming educated about the role of diet and nutrition may be able to give excellent advice. The problem is it's not a part of their inherent training. The health promotion is not a primary focus of most people that are in medicine. And so, many of the physicians, well-meaning but misguided that they are, don't really know because it's really not been part of their scope. If they've taken it upon themselves to become educated, then hopefully they're giving excellent advice to people.
In Chapter 4 of The Pleasure Trap, what did you mean by the miracle and madness of modern medicine, the role of pain, the healing goal?
Well, the idea is that pain is there for a reason. It's the body's way of signaling us something is wrong. And so if you just go in and get rid of the pain with one of the miracles of modern medicine's drugs, that doesn't necessarily get rid of the reason why you had the pain. And the reason that you had the pain can continue. And so sometimes medicine itself becomes a part of the pleasure trap. It's because we do something to make us feel better, but it doesn't necessarily help us get better.
In Chapter 5 of The Pleasure Trap, what did you mean by the evolution of diet, modern civilization, and the disease of kings?
Well, in the world of our ancient ancestors, this was an environment of scarcity, and people used to eat as much as they could whenever they could, but rarely got dietary excess and exposure, except those wealthy elite that we called kings. And they were able to indulge in a diet that looked more like what people eat today, more highly processed foods, more animal foods. And they developed characteristic diseases that used to be very rare: heart disease, diabetes, gout. And these were referred to as the diseases of kings because it seemed like it was only the kings that got those diseases. But now people in our society are able to get, well, diseases that only kings used to get.
What effect does water fasting have on a woman going through menopause? Does it help women who are having urinary tract issues, bladder issues, low sex drive, migraine headaches, and hormonal imbalance?
Well, fasting's like rebooting the hard drive on a computer that's become corrupted. A lot of times, even though we can't always explain exactly how it's working, it seems to recalibrate the mechanism. So many of these symptoms that you described often respond very well to a whole plant food SOS-free diet and exercise program, as well as in maybe a more facilitated way to water-only fasting.
In chapter 14 of The Pleasure Trap, what did you mean by the myths of moderation, breaking free?
Well, the idea is that, moderation is always a good idea when you're talking about something that has a normal relationship to the human organism. But something that has an abnormal relationship to the organism isn't necessarily going to be better because you moderate it. It'll be less bad. But something being less bad doesn't make it good. And so what we're talking about is that you want to talk about moderation in terms of normal, healthy activities, but we want to eliminate unhealthy activities. So, drinking in moderation is a misconception because there's no amount of alcohol that doesn't have a potentially toxic effect. So just drinking less of it doesn't actually make it healthy, it just makes it somewhat less bad.
Is water fasting helpful to cancer patients, or could it be dangerous?
Well, yes, inappropriately used, fasting or any other intervention could present problems. It's important with fasting, like all treatment modalities, that be used in appropriate patients in inappropriate ways. There's nothing about having cancer per se that would necessarily eliminate the possibility of including fasting in the overall approach to managing the condition. And in some types of cancers, we have evidence that fasting is particularly effective at giving the body a selective advantage. It turns out that cancer cells don't like the fasting state very well. Their reduced mitochondrial load makes them more dependent on glucose, for example. So in an environment that doesn't contain glucose, like or has much reduced levels of glucose, as in fasting, may put those cancer cells at a selective disadvantage. Walter Longo and others have published data suggesting that the combination of fasting with conventional therapies may augment the effectiveness of the conventional therapies and improve all-cause survival.
Do you recommend people do a 36-hour water fast once a week or once a month at home?
What I recommend is that patients fast every day, and that fasting period will range from 12 to 16 hours depending on the patient and their specific needs. So that would mean not eating, for example, 3 hours before you go to sleep at night, not eating too early in the morning, giving yourself a period of fasting. That cumulatively is thought to have a benefit. And there's actually studies now suggesting improved glycemic control, reduced breast cancer recurrence, just by extending that period of fasting during the evening. And then I recommend that patients may occasionally consider the possibility of a longer medically supervised fasting in a controlled setting.
In chapter 15 of The Pleasure Trap, what did you mean by fasting can save your life and escaping the pleasure trap?
The people in our society are now largely suffering from conditions including metabolic syndrome. So elevated blood pressure, blood glucose levels, abdominal obesity, and the like. These contributing factors to the metabolic syndrome all respond very aggressively to medically supervised water-only fasting. And so fasting helps reverse the consequences of dietary excess in a way that really isn't as efficient by any other method that we've discovered. And so I literally believe that fasting can save your life.
What is the ideal fasting schedule for a person who is going to do it from their home? Should they do it once a month, once every 3 months? How long should each fast be?
Well, I recommend people fast every day from 12 to 16 hours. And that when longer-term fasting is considered, you really need to do that in conjunction with a physician that's familiar with fasting, because it's important that there be appropriate history, exam, and lab so the fasting can be done safely and effectively. And that's particularly true for people that have disease and/or are on medication.
Does water fasting help the body get rid of pathogenic bacteria in the body?
Water fasting can be very helpful at helping the body resolve some of these chronic, both viral and bacterial infections that are oftentimes reluctant to respond to more conventional care.
Some health people say we need salt. Why are you recommending against eating it?
Well, I believe that you do need sodium, and it's an essential nutrient without which you die. It just turns out that you get all the salt you need from a whole plant food SOS-free diet, just like you get all the fat that you need from a whole plant food SOS-free diet, and you get all the carbohydrates and sugar that you need from a whole plant food SOS-free diet. You do not need to add exogenous salt, sugar, or oil to the diet in order to get the quantity and quality of nutrients that you need to sustain and maintain optimum health.
You recommend a daily fast. Would a weekly 36-hour water fast help with gastrointestinal issues?
It might, but we recommend that longer-term water fasting be done in conjunction with a doctor that's experienced with fasting so that the appropriate history, exam, and lab can be ensured.
In Chapter 7 of The Pleasure Trap, what did you mean by losing weight without losing your mind? The law of satiation, towels, circuits, skinny jeans.
Yeah, so we talk about the fact that the body's designed to maintain optimum weight in a natural setting with a natural diet, a whole plant food diet. However, in the modern world, with our highly processed foods, we can fool the satiety mechanisms of the brain into overeating. And that's why salt, oil, and sugar can be so insidious. By including those in the diet, you stimulate overeating, and cumulatively that results in obesity and the diseases of kings.
Would a 36-hour water fast improve memory?
So we recommend that everybody fast for a period of 12 to 16 hours. And the cumulative effect of that intermittent fasting may have tremendous beneficial effects, including memory, although memory is not just diet, it also can be affected by things like sleep. You know, sleep deprivation is one of the biggest ways to impair short-term as well as long-term memory function. So we recommend that people not only eat a whole plant food diet, but also they get abundant sleep, they engage in regular exercise, and they learn to manage their stress effectively. And cumulatively, those are often very effective in helping preserve cognitive function.
Do the water fasts you recommend remove chemicals and radiation from the body?
Water fasting is an effective way of giving the body a chance to mobilize and eliminate accumulated metabolic products, endogenous and exogenous toxins. In fact, there are some people that suggest that fasting is so efficient at doing that that you need to be careful because it might overwhelm the body. The fact, in our experience, appropriately screened patients that are fasted appropriately are perfectly capable of modulating the quantity and quality of toxins that are mobilized and eliminated during fasting.
In Chapter 17 of The Pleasure Trap, what did you mean by true north, the road home?
There's a lot of different paths people are told to take, and there's a lot of conflicting information out there. At the True North Health Center, what we're trying to do is distill all that information and give people a path to wellness that we believe is consistent with the scientific literature.
What's wrong with eating eggs?
Well, eggs, like all animal products, suffer from the issues of biological concentration, bacterial contamination, viral exposures. They're also extremely high in protein and fat, which we're finding we have to actually try to limit. So eggs are not fundamentally different than any animal products in the whole list of contraindications. So we recommend people adopt a whole plant food diet that avoids meat, fish, fowl, eggs, and dairy products.
In Chapter 3 of The Pleasure Trap, what did you mean by The Pleasure Trap, the rewards of pleasure? Magic buttons?
So there are certain magic buttons out there that people can become vulnerable to. An example of that are the highly processed foods, the sugar, the oil, the salt. And these chemicals actually fool the satiety mechanisms, stimulate dopamine production in the brain, and lead people to overeating.
In Chapter 6 of The Pleasure Trap, what did you mean by looking for health in all the wrong places? Mental biases, health by subtraction?
So the idea is that everybody naturally is thinking that whatever their problem is, it's because they're missing something. In a natural setting, that would probably be generally true, that deficiency and depletion, would be a dominant cause. But in the modern world, it's turning out not deficiency that's the main problem, but excess. And so people keep looking for the pill or potion or powder to correct their purported deficiency, when really what the problem is they're getting too much fat, too much oil, too much sugar, too much calories, and developing metabolic syndrome and the diseases of dietary excess.
Would a weekly 36-hour water fast, or the fast that you recommend, help balance blood sugar?
We do recommend that people fast for some 12 to 16 hours every day. And that period of fasting is consistent with improved glycemic control. And there's actually studies now coming out in the literature that support that claim.
Should people listen to the media, universities, politicians, and government agencies regarding health and nutrition?
Well, I think they should listen to everybody and then become educated enough that they can make their own mind up about what seems real and what's not real. I think sometimes common sense can go a long way to helping us kind of filter the information. And always ask yourself, where's the money?
In Chapter 1 of The Pleasure Trap, what did you mean by telling the truth, understanding health and happiness?
So, what we're trying to do is filter the information that's available and tell people what they need to know, not necessarily what they want to hear. If you're trying to make money in society, the fastest way to do that is to tell people what they want to hear, sell them on the things that they find desirable, not to necessarily tell them what they need to know. And so in our book, The Pleasure Trap, Mastering the Hidden Force to Undermine Health and Happiness, we tried to tell people the things they need to know to get and stay healthy.
In Chapter 2 of The Pleasure Trap, what did you mean by the biological purpose of life, the motivational triad, and the moods of happiness?
So people are driven by pleasure-seeking, pain avoidance, and energy conservation. That's what we call the motivational triad. That's what motivates all animals, to seek pleasure, to avoid pain, and to try to conserve energy. Because those mechanisms were designed for an environment of scarcity, where it was really important to seek pleasure, and the natural, normal stimulants of pleasure are things like eating and sexual behavior. But in the natural setting, you don't have the artificial stimulation of drugs, etc. And as a consequence, in a natural setting, you could follow your instincts and reliably increase your likelihood of surviving and reproducing. In the modern world, you can become trapped by this artificial stimulation of pleasure that leads us to overeating and engaging in health-compromising behaviors.
In Chapter 12 of The Pleasure Trap, what did you mean by let there be light, the need for sleep?
So sleep's one of our most important activities. Sleep is when energy is actually generated, where you're converting ADP to ATP, and the internal mechanisms of vitality are renewed. With sleep deprivation comes fatigue. By definition, if people are fatigued, they're not getting the quantity or quality of sleep they need to compensate for the stresses of the previous day. So I believe one of our most important activities is getting enough sleep and rest. And now there's research suggesting that not getting enough sleep, for example, can lead to a buildup of chemical materials that may compromise the brain and lead to premature aging of the brain, conditions like dementia and Alzheimer's disease. So an important part of that prevention may in turn be giving the body a chance to flush everything clean during adequate sleep each night.
What did Walter Longo say about intermittent fasting, and do you agree with him?
Well, I think Walter Longo is a really brilliant scientist. And I largely evaluate other people's intelligence to the degree that they agree with me. So that makes him a near genius, because what he's done is he's actually done a really credible job of investigating particularly intermittent fasting and modified versions of fasting and the effect that it has on the body, and publishing in major scientific journals issues related to fasting. And he's helped increase people's awareness and discussion about fasting. So I'm very grateful to Walter Longo and his organization for the research that they continue to do.
In Chapter 13 of The Pleasure Trap, what did you mean by Heartbreak Hotel, the happiness strategy?
Well, there's a difference between pleasure and happiness. And pleasure we know is dopamine dominated. It's a neural response that is the reward at the end of the process, for example. Happiness is really more of a mood state, and it's something that can be sustainable. You can only do so much pleasure, and pleasure is an expensive biological response. But sustaining the moods of happiness, that the overall balance of your life experience is perceived as highly positive, is something that we all strive to do. And so we just have to remember that happiness is the process, pleasure is the end result, that pleasure can lead to a pleasure trap if the pleasure is coming from the artificial stimulation of dopamine that comes from engaging behaviors that ultimately can be health compromising.
In Chapter 9 of The Pleasure Trap, what did you mean by getting along without going along, the Milgram experiment, preparing for integrity?
Well, Milgram was a famous individual who did some research that showed that people can be manipulated into engaging in very undesirable behavior. And so I think that the fact is we all have to recognize that we're vulnerable to manipulation because of our basic nature and how we're designed.
In Chapter 10 of The Pleasure Trap, what did you mean by the path of least resistance, steps to a healthy lifestyle?
Well, there's a process. There's a method and a process and some methods and processes are more successful than others. And so following a successful strategy takes into account all the things that we know about what leads to health and happiness.
In Chapter 8 of The Pleasure Trap, what did you mean by magic food, the dietary pleasure trap, rate your diet and lifestyle?
Well, we gave people a chance to kind of evaluate their past history and determine, how vulnerable they're likely to be to the issues that are going to be presented in the modern world.
Would the water fast you recommend be appropriate for children between the ages of 12 and 18?
As in all people, to determine whether fasting is appropriate, you really want to go through the history exam and laboratory findings on an individual to determine if the indications and contraindications are being appropriately evaluated. There's nothing about age necessarily, young or old, that would absolutely preclude a person from being able to consider fasting. But as in the very elderly, in the very young, there are vulnerabilities that have to be considered.
Do you recommend daily use of far-red infrared saunas?
We don't recommend the routine use of far-red infrared saunas. However, there are people that are using them therapeutically. I'm not familiar with the literature, so I can't say with definitely, how indicated or contraindicated they might be for a given condition.
In Chapter 16 of The Pleasure Trap, what did you mean by show me the data, removing the cause?
Well, I think fundamentally one of the mistakes that's made with modern medicine is they're so worried about trying to provide people relief that they're not necessarily always focused on dealing with the reasons that people develop the problems to begin with. In our society, we spend most of our money treating the leading cause of death, which is cancer, heart disease, and stroke, instead of focusing on the actual causes of disease, which is smoking, drinking, and eating an animal-based, highly fractionated food diet.
Can you sum up everything we've talked about here today in 15 seconds?
I think so. Health results from healthful living. Healthful living includes diet, sleep, and exercise. A diet is a whole plant food, SOS-free diet. Exercise should be plentiful, sleep abundant, so that you can wake spontaneously and feel refreshed.
What's the one thing I must do today?
Well, the one thing you must do today is keep breathing.
What is it about the Real Truth About Health conference that makes you want to come here and speak?
I'm always interested in hearing a variety of opinions and thoughts because I think it helps make sure that we don't get too comfortable in our own belief systems. So I like the challenge of listening to people that completely disagree with me and have a varied amount of opinions because I find it real stimulating and an opportunity to challenge and check our belief systems.
For people that want to learn more about your work, where should they go?
Go to our website at truenorthhealth.com, and if they're interested, they can complete the registration forms, and we offer a no-cost phone conversation so we can discuss whether any of this might be relevant to them. The True North Health Foundation is a 501c3 nonprofit research organization. Its website, fasting.org, has a fasting compendium site. People that are interested in learning more about the cutting-edge research on fasting can go to fasting.org, and the material is freely available.